Welcome everybody. Today's lecture is China's sphere of influence, which is Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. This coincides with chapter 13 in your red and black book that you are not reading. You are just going to watch the lecture and download the PowerPoint. First, let's talk about China's influence. China served as a model of development, and it spread to Japan in the 5th and 6th century BCE. And here's Japan. It spread to Vietnam and Korea in the last centuries BCE. Here are the Koreas, and here is Vietnam. Chinese culture blended with local culture, and Buddhism played a key role in transmitting Chinese culture. They were all linked to China, and in doing so, they were further isolated from the rest of the world. Let's notice the size of China, how it kind of serves as a barrier to this area of the world. Let's take a look at Japan's geography. If you notice that Japan is broken into islands, there's 4 islands and hundreds of small islands. This first big island up here is Hokkaido. The second, and which is the largest main island, is Honshu. And then towards the bottom you have Shikoku and Kyushu. If you look over to the left, this is Japanese writing. We call it kanji. This is Japanese writing for the word Japan, Nihon. Moving on, we will talk about Japan's imperial age. First, let's define the word imperial. Imperial means of or relating to an empire. So Chinese influence peaked in Japan from the 7th to the 8th century. They set up, modeled after the Chinese style of bureaucracy, army, etiquette is like manners, and arts. There are 2 civilized centers, Naro and Heian. And there's also reform, the Taika reforms in 646 CE. And these reforms entailed the Japanese government who was seeking to make Japan like China. And so under these reforms, they were copying most of China's systems. Challenges during this time period. Traditional Japanese religious views, we call it Shintoism. And so the Japanese were having selective borrowing from the Chinese. Aristocrats who wanted to return to traditional values gained power, and so they were more likely to lean towards Shintoism rather than Confucianism. And Buddhist monasteries were forbidden in Heian, but they were built around the outside of Heian, gaining power. And so you have the government who's trying to be more like China based on Confucianism, challenged by the rise of Buddhist aristocracy who were trying to push their ideology of Buddhism. And so there is this power struggle occurring. This power struggle gets so intense that the emperor leaves Nara to Heian, which is modern-day Kyoto. And if you look at the arrow, it shows you the shift from Nara to Heian. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the Buddhists gained power. So the Buddhists would be against the rise of Chinese values in Japan. The empire is threatened by Buddhism, and this is why they move. And Heian is only 28 miles from Nara. In Heian, Buddhist monasteries are forbidden. However, they're built on the outskirts, and they do wind up gaining power. So how did the Japanese live? Here's an image of court life in the Heian era. Their life was based on luxury, aesthetics. Aesthetics are all things that are beautiful. Social status. Think of how people perceive each other. Modern day connection would be Facebook. Poetry, gossip, palaces, gardens. One of the most famous literature that came out of this time period from Japan is the Tale of Genji. And the Tale of Genji was written by Lady Murasaki, and she wrote about court life in Japan. And so this was a very high level of living. So after a while, there's going to be a decline of the imperial power, and there's going to be a rise of the warrior elite. The Fujiwara family, who's most influential in the 9th century in Japan, gained large estates. Estates is large areas of land. And then they married into the ruling aristocracy, and so they were able to gain power in doing so. Elite families in provinces withheld land from aristocrats. Think of provinces as being in the rural areas, and they created local governments ruled by local lords. And these formed into a sort of mini states. Bushi were warriors, and samurai were mounted troops, warriors who were effective and loyal to lords. So a samurai was a bushi, but a bushi was not always a samurai. And everyone relied on the serfs for food. Serfs were bound to land. They were treated different than the samurai. There was a rigid class system, which means that it wasn't flexible at all. And so if you were a serf, you were probably going to stay a serf. And so the serfs would turn to Buddhism. And the upper class looked at Zen Buddhism, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And the lower class focused on the Buddhism that's associated with salvation. And so now we move on to the dominance of these warriors, the Bushi and the samurai. And so there's a lot of strife after the 12th century, which peaks in the 15th to 16th century until the Tokugawa shogunate. There are issues between the Minamoto family and the Taira family. And in 1885, the Minamoto family destroys the Taira family. And the Minamoto family sets up a bakufu, which is a military government. And what they do is they leave the emperor in Heian alone. But it is the Minamoto family and the samurai that have the real power. And this begins the feudal age in Japan. And so there is a declining influence of China. Due to the decline of the imperial base, the upper class no longer is seeking Chinese goods because there has now been a shift to the warrior elite. Buddhism also becomes distinctively Japanese, and so it modifies, the original Buddhist tradition that had came from India through China and into Japan. Also, officials stopped visiting China, and they stopped paying China tribute as well. Yoritomo Minamoto becomes very suspicious of his family, and so he kills his entire family, and he begins the Kamakura Shogun. Shogun is a military rule, and he's ruthless. He dies without a hair. The Hojo family is able to take control, but they leave the Minamoto Shogun in place, and they continue to rule in the name of the emperor. Under the Ashikaga shogunate in 1336 to 1573, the Kamakura shogun is overthrown and the emperor is exiled. And so the results of this breakdown is that the emperor's weaken, the Bushi warlord powers grow, the court aristocracy is weakened, the samurai are given land in exchange for protection, and there is a decentralization of the government into 300 kingdoms. And this is the rise of the warlord ruler called daimyo, which you could think of as a lord. Okay, we're at the end of Japan, so let's talk about military division and social change as well. So there's castles from the 15th to 16th century. The peasant armies begin to replace the samurai, so you have the decline of the samurai. There's a lot of chaos and suffering. There's new tools, there's new crops, and there's also the growth of profitable items such as silk, hemp, paper, dyes, and oil. There's a new merchant class, and they set up guilds. Notice how much of this resembles medieval Europe. So, you need to be comparing and contrasting across areas. And if you were to look at to the image on the right, you'll see the longbow. And women were taught in merchant families to learn how to sell items, and the women in the warrior family learn how to ride horses and to use the longbow as well. Under arts, you have the rise of Zen Buddhism. And so down here to the right is an image of a rock garden, which is symbolic of Zen Buddhism to focus on beauty and the aesthetics of the world. Also, the rise of pavilions, which is very famously known in Japan, tea ceremony. There's also a rise in the creation of a nationhood. And so this is Japan becoming one Japan. And there's economic and cultural growth during the warlord era, which prevented barbarianism, and the daimyo, which were the lords, improved administration and unified Japan. Okay, now we're moving to Korea. And so Korea was most impacted by China. However, it also created a separate, distinct identity. And so look at that map and make sure you know where Korea is in relation to China. Notice also how close it is to Japan. First, let's look at early Korea. So early Korea began with the Joseon Empire in the 4th century BCE. It had a lot of farming, and it was captured by Han China and settled by the Chinese. It was broken into 3 kingdoms: Goryeo, Pakshe, and Shiya. Afterwards, this led to Sinification, which is the extensive adoption of Chinese culture. And so Korea was modeled very similar to China. And Buddhism is linked to Korea and China, and the government is styled after China. And so that's why if you ever wonder why Korean culture is so similar to China, this is the reason why. So there's a Tang alliance. Tang is reference to China. Within the 3 kingdoms, there's an internal warfare, which makes them weak. And Tang China is able to beat Paiche and Goryeo. And it made a deal with Xia in 668 and withdrew the Chinese army. And so Koreans are able to maintain their independence and political boundaries until the 20th century when Japan invades them. And so Sinification, we had said, was the establishment of Chinese culture, and this is highly evident under the Kingdom of Xia from 668 to the late 19th century, as well as the Goryeo dynasty in 918 to 1392. They imitated the Tang Empire. They paid the Chinese tribute, which guaranteed peace. Koreans received Chinese literature, dress, and goods, not gods, like it says. And Korea served as a channel between its neighbors. Okay, I have fixed the word goods. And now let's look at the images. So you have a beautiful crown. You have influence from China, as we said. And you also have the Goryeo dynasty. Okay, let's talk about the Korean elite. And so the Korean elite lived in mansions and palaces. They had slaves. They studied in Chinese schools. They had birth privileges, and they favored Buddhism over Confucianism, and so the Chinese were not able to win over Koreans under the ideologies of religion. They did learn porcelain manufacturing from the Chinese, but all the imports coming in from China were only for the elites, and so the lower classes were not exposed to as much signification as the upper class, and all the lower classes worked for the elites. And so we're going to end with Korea, but remember the key point with Korea is how closely it copied China in the social system, in economics, in political systems, and of course the proximity or the location of Korea to China and the influence of many of the dynasties over time. Okay, we're moving into our last area of Chinese influence, which is Vietnam. Vietnam was located along the Red River Valley in the BCE time period. And you can see how this is a Google Earth image. It looks red, the river. It's a rice-growing civilization, and it was highly developed by the time the Chinese arrived. And so, although China can have a lot of influence, it's not going to have as much as Korea. It's similar to other Southeast Asian countries and blended with them. So you'll find more similarities between Vietnam and Cambodia or Laos or Thailand. And the people are known as the Viets, and they were invaded by the Qin. That's the Qin dynasty of China. and conquered by the Han. And so let's take a look at some of the images. We looked at the Red River already. Here is Vietnam on a world map. This is this landmass is Asia. They are known as the Austroasiatic rice farming people, and so this would be the hearth or the birthplace of Vietnamese culture. So let's talk about social systems in Vietnamese. And so they lived, the villages had autonomy. Autonomy is like independence. They're based on the nuclear family. Your nuclear family would be like mom, dad, brother, sister. They were not based on extended family like China. Remember, China had veneration or respect for grandparents, and so you would have several families living together in China. Some differences between Vietnam and China is women wore long skirts in Vietnam, while women in China wore black pants. Women in Vietnam went to or saw, and not just women, but also men, cockfighting, which is where the roosters fight. They also chewed a betel nut, which is from the betel tree. It is a mild stimulant, and it is for medicinal purposes. And the betel nut, if you look up here at the image, is right here. And what it does is it blackens teeth. And so the Chinese thought that the Vietnamese women were gross for doing that. And there's a distinct literature and art, and most Vietnamese people are Buddhist. And so at the bottom image is what a small typical village would look like today. China did not have the same relationship with Vietnam as it did with Japan and Korea. There is a lot of resistance on behalf of the Vietnamese people. However, they did pay tribute to China, usually by force. Han conquered them. They attended Chinese schools. There is a rise of Confucianism. Chinese farming techniques are adopted. The Vietnamese also copied China's political and military system. The Vietnamese aristocracy, though, never fully embraced Chinese imports the way the upper class in Japan and Korea did. And in turn, the Chinese did not care for Vietnamese culture as well. And so Vietnam gained independence after the fall of Tang in 939. And women did not like the male dominance of Confucianism because women in Vietnam are more independent than in other Asian countries. Okay, I have fixed the word there, so that is the Tang dynasty. So let's talk about the continuing impact in Vietnam. Scholarly gentries never enjoyed as much power as those in China. Local officials sided with peasants rather than with Chinese officials. And there's a strong connection with Buddhist monastic orders rather than with Chinese Confucianism. Women are also held high in Buddhism, which was in opposition of Neo-Confucianism that was occurring at the time. The Viets also defeated the Chams, who were originally natives of the island of Borneo in Indonesia, and they had migrated in the early 2nd century CE to Vietnam, and they lived in southeast Vietnam. And so looking at the map, South Vietnam is in this area. And so they speak a different language than most of the Vietnamese, and in modern day times, they're also the higher population of Muslims in the area. The Khmers were from Cambodia, and the Vietnamese saw the Chams and the Khmers as savages, and because they were often referred to as beasts. They were drove into the highlands so that the Vietnamese could extend their kingdom to the south. But in doing so, there was cultural convergence, and the South Vietnamese adopted Chams and Khmer customs. And when the France arrived in the early 19th century, the Viets were highly divided. And if you were to look at the map, you can see that there are many different language families, which means that there's many different cultures in Vietnam. And so this slide ends the lecture on China's influence. Let's look at some similarities between Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Each region was fertile, which allowed sedentary civilization. Sedentary means to stay in one place. They focused on wet rice crops. They transported writing and bureaucratic organization. They all shared political organization, social development, and intellectual development. And so the purpose of this lecture is to show you how influential China was in the East Asian area during the period from early history up until around the 19th century. The next lecture is on the Mongols. Welcome everybody. Today's lecture is China's sphere of influence, which is Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. This coincides with chapter 13 in your red and black book that you are not reading. You are just going to watch the lecture and download the PowerPoint. First, let's talk about China's influence. China served as a model of development, and it spread to Japan in the 5th and 6th century BCE. And here's Japan. It spread to Vietnam and Korea in the last centuries BCE. Here are the Koreas, and here is Vietnam. Chinese culture blended with local culture, and Buddhism played a key role in transmitting Chinese culture. They were all linked to China, and in doing so, they were further isolated from the rest of the world. Let's notice the size of China, how it kind of, still look over to the left. This is Japanese writing. We call it kanji. This is Japanese writing for the word Japan, Nihon. Moving on, we will talk about Japan's imperial age. First, let's define the word imperial. Imperial means of or relating to an empire. So Chinese influence peaked in Japan from the 7th to the 8th century. They set up, modeled after the Chinese style of bureaucracy, army, etiquette is like manners, and arts. There are 2 civilized centers, Naro and Heian. And there's also reform, the Taika reforms in 646 CE. And these reforms entailed the Japanese government who was seeking to make Japan like China. And so under these reforms, they were copying, serves as a barrier to this area of the world. Let's take a look at Japan's geography. If you notice that Japan is broken into islands, there's 4 islands and hundreds of small islands. This first big island appears Hokkaido. The second, and which is the largest main island, is Honshu. And then towards the bottom you have Shikoku and Kyushu. If